if you get someone just coming up to you and saying, "Hey, you owe me $100,000 because I said so," it's a PPAP.
Yeah.
You got to do that. They're going to say, "Well, we've just done a PPAP over here," and the buyer may not even know what all the requirements are. So you've got to inform the buyer to say, "Hey, look, your engineering department's asking for this. Typically, when we submit this, we do not have to pay for that."
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. If you have been thinking about penetrating the automotive market, your customers will ask you to comply with the PPAP processes. You need to comply with several requirements, irrespective of your tiers, such as communicating any process or line changes in your facility. You will also have additional testing requirements at the transaction level, such as corrosion testing, etc. If you don't understand these standards, you have a risk of losing your customer or wasting money on non-conforming parts. In today's episode, we have our guest, Ken Hatlewick, who discusses the nuances of the PPAP process for machine shops serving the automotive market. He also touches on the testing requirements at the transaction level and the audit and compliance requirements annually. Finally, he shares several stories about how upfront communication and relationships with your customer could help navigate issues if you run into challenges while complying with PPAP guidelines. Let me introduce Ken to you. Ken Hatlewick is an engineering manager at Falcon Plastics. He has 29 years of experience in manufacturing. Ken's roles over the years have included operations manager, production manager, quality manager, product development coordinator, tool maker, and plastic processing. He works closely with customers in finding common ground and making design concepts a reality as the new products are successfully launched. Ken currently resides in Tennessee with his wife and 4 kids. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Ken, welcome to the show.
Well, hey Sam, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course, and I'm super excited to have you as well, just because the kind of experience you bring from the PPAP perspective and the quality work that you have done, it's going to be super beneficial for our listeners. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus, Ken?
Sure, yeah. And I guess, I've been working with a current company here for, it's 26 and a half years, I guess. So during that time, I've held different roles. I started as a tool maker, going through, building molds, and then also to the point where I was over production for a period of time as a production manager, then got into product development for years there. And that's really where I started in with the PPAP process. A little bit while I was in the production area there, but really got deep dive into it with the product development, because then you have to do more of the actual, nuts and bolts of it, getting into actually putting the documentation together. And then, I've actually managed or was a plant manager over a plant in South Dakota there, and then from there now I'm back down into Tennessee, where I'm an engineering manager over the facility now. So
okay, amazing. And again, you have a very solid background, and I'm pretty sure you are going to have tons and tons of stories where we are going to get tons of learning for our listeners. So we have one of the standard questions that we ask every single guest that come on the show, and that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
So, yeah, as far as business growth, going through the PPAP process, really it's like in the old days, there was a handshake between two business partners as they were coming together to do business together, and it was just an understanding. Back then that worked because there wasn't maybe quite as much at stake. As you grow now and as you get into business, I mean, that handshake has to be done more formally. And we start looking at it, and the PPAP process really brings that out. So the reason it's important is because without it, you're not maybe taking all of the items, I guess, into consideration. So when you start wanting to put together your process, you've got to consider what may all go wrong. So people are looking at your PFMEAs and trying to understand all the failure modes that you may have. And without doing that, you may end up not intending to, but you may end up failing and sending out bad parts. And what that causes, in terms as of today, I mean, you've got lines that are running hundreds of people. And if you're dealing with a large OEM, you may be getting charged back a lot of money based off of just a slight oversight on your initial documentation. So
interesting, very interesting overall. And I like the way you think about the whole process and doing the handshake formally, because it is really that, to be honest. I mean, when we look at the overall process and the benefits that it actually brings to the table. So before we get into some of the things that you just mentioned, I would like to dig into chargebacks as well, how they work. But do you want to set the stage and describe what PPAP process is, which industries are going to be relevant for the PPAP process, and why they should be doing that?
Yeah, typically the PPAP process, I mean, it really, I guess as far as our perspective goes, it started with, some automotive experience. And, those are where it really kind of drove it home for us as far as getting into this process. Other industries will have similar documentations. They may or may not call it PPAP. We have other ones that may call it, a supplier quality approval. There's multiple names for different things depending on the environment you're working in. But really, PPAP is kind of like the umbrella. It's kind of like Kleenex versus tissue paper. It's really kind of what everyone recognizes.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the features of the supplier quality management, right? So let's say if I'm the owner and I've never done a PPAP before, right? And I may not have these processes, or maybe I have some of them. I just don't realize that I'm probably doing them because it actually helps me overall, right? And I'm not as worried about the chargebacks. So let's say if I am trying to do this for the first time, what am I looking at? So am I validating the suppliers when I hire them? Is there a specific recruitment process in terms of the way I should be engaging with the suppliers? Am I looking at their performance? Am I looking at their data? So what is the overarching process? Can you describe that?
So when you're getting new business from a supplier, I mean, there's expectations that have to be put forth. So as you're doing the quoting process, knowing your customer, even back into the quoting side of things, knowing your customer does help, because if you go forward and you don't anticipate that there's going to be expectations as far as a PPAP, there may be when you start getting into it, you may actually have some testing that's involved, and that testing may cost you thousands of dollars. So you need to be aware of your customer and what the expectations are, even back in the quoting stages. So as you get into this, you're starting to, let's say you get the project, right? You're being awarded something, and when you're awarded that, so there's going to be some meetings as far as setting the stage to what the expectations are. And during that meeting, you're hoping that you have the right people in the room, and you may or may not. But getting to that point, your buyer that is going to be purchasing from you should be able to set the stage and say, hey, look, you're going to ask them the question of who will actually approve this. Who in your, get a name, get a person, a title that from their organization, hey, this is the guy that's going to approve this for you, and at least get up that communication between that person, so you can understand the full impact of what you have to, I guess, submit to get approvals.
Interesting. So do you have any examples of the testing that you mentioned? So let's say if somebody might be selling to Automotive, they might not be doing this process. All of a sudden, they get this document from the customer that you need to follow these processes if you want to work with us. So is there any example that you might be able to provide? What kind of testing is going to be in terms of the product that these industries might be building? So what kind of testing are we talking about here?
So yeah, there's multiple testing that could be when you're looking at different materials and different components. For instance, if you have an insert that's placed into a mold and it's overmolded, and so you've got something in this part that's other than your base manufacturing there that you did in the plant, you may have to do a corrosion test on the insert. Which means you'll have to send that out. You have to go to a certified lab. And you'll basically get information on what type of chemicals it needs to be resistant to, whether it's oil, whether it's acid, whether it's something. But those are the things that the customer needs to provide to you. And then also with that, there might be some push out, pull out type force things that are more of a mechanical thing, which are easier to do, but they still need to be at a certified lab. So if you have any requirements like that, you say, oh, well, we can get those dimensions. Well, yes, you may be able to get the dimensions, or you get the readings that you need, but unless it's a certified lab, it really is not credited. So it really doesn't count.
Okay, interesting. And let's say if I don't comply with this, or maybe, I am trying as an owner, I am trying to instruct my guys, but I mean, they are probably missing these things. And because of that, you mentioned that you are probably going to get chargebacks. So can you describe an example of some of these chargebacks that you have seen in your experience because of the non-compliance? Do they require any sort of certification as part of the process when they are going to receive the part for the testing from the lab to make sure that the parts are tested?
So I think I'm understanding you correctly. You're looking for an example of, say, when we went through something where, hey, you struggled with it a little bit, getting the requirements just right. So an example that would go right along with this, as far as when I talk about an insert or something being molded in, we had worked with a supplier to get a cost down for our customer. And as you go through and do that, there's you got to get that component PPAP, and then also PPAP your own part to your customer. And as we went through one, which is why I said it's very important to understand your customer and who's going to do the approvals. We had one quality representative at our customers that basically said, hey, this is what your requirements are. And unfortunately, it did not include the engineering department at this facility. And we submitted parts with what we were understanding, what we needed to do for testing. And it turned out that we were missing certain stuff. But we got the quality person actually to sign off on our PPAP, which we didn't know any different at the time. So knowing who that person is very important. So it turned out that we needed additional testing as far as like corrosion and a few other things there that we hadn't known about because we didn't work with the right person. So it ended up causing us a lot of, I guess, jumping through hoops in order to make sure everything was right. It still turned out before we were supplying parts, we got it figured out, but it delayed a project that, could have been in the works much sooner.
Okay, and can you touch back on the chargeback? So I don't know if these chargebacks are going to be mentioned as part of the initial specification that you are getting from your customer that, I am asking you to do all of this, and if you don't do this, then I have these penalties for you. So are these chargebacks mentioned as part of the specification? Do you have any examples that you might be able to share of the chargebacks?
So when in relationship to the PPAP specifically, when you start bringing on something, if the You can look at it several different ways. You can quote it out as a PPAP package separately to your
Okay.
customer, but that typically has to be done up in the quoting stage. If you don't do it in the quoting stage, you're going to get a lot of feedback, or pushback from your customer to want to pay for that. Typically, the product itself should pay for the PPAP process. It's all dependent on what product you're providing. Some products have a lot of risk to them and a lot of testing that go with it. Those type of products, you're going to want to have that PPAP process probably spelled out in the quoting stages. Otherwise, you're not going to get that covered. So typically, most of our stuff is included in either like a tooling cost or in like the part price, as you'll make it up as you run parts, right?
Okay, very interesting insight there, and I want to make sure that our listeners are able to understand this well. So, when we look at any of the quality compliance sort of certification, when we talk about your ISO, when we talk about your AS, typically in that, what you do is you sort of get the certification, and after that, as long as you are certified, you are sort of covered. I mean, it's not necessarily part of your quoting process. But the way you are trying to describe here is you are saying that, the customers are actually going to request the specific PPAP quality measurement that you need to do, and that is going to be included, and you have an ability to be able to quote for those specific steps, and that is going to be part of your quoting, right?
That is the way that you should handle that. There's people that may overlook that, and then you're looking in their rearview mirror and kind of fretting about, oh, how are we going to handle this? And going to the customer with your, as they give you new expectations that maybe you were not aware of during your quote, that does give you opportunity to head back to them and say, hey, look, this is actually going to cost us X amount of money. We're going to need some additional funds to move forward here. And if not, I guess it may not work for you, right?
Yeah, very interesting. So typically, let's say if I'm looking at my sales order, I have sent out to my customer, and I am looking at, what, you are going to require this corrosion testing. Am I required to specify the name of the lab there where I'm going to be testing? Is that need to be spelled out as well? Or is it really, what, I'm going to do something related to PPAP, and that is going to cost you $100,000, and that is actually part of your quote. If you need more details, email me. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I guess when you start looking at it, and if you're going into something where you're going to be charging back $100,000 or something to that extent, the customer's going to really want to understand that when they get into that, and just you're going to have to relate it to, hey, your expectation here based off your PPAP, you're asking for this type of a test, and this test here, in order to do that, it's going to take X amount of time and it's going to cost this amount of money, and then also here at this other stage, you're asking for this type of testing, which may or may not be something that we anticipated originally, and it's going to cost this much amount of money. Really, I think you need to spell that out to your customer, because you don't want them to think, if you get someone just coming up to you and saying, hey, you owe me $100,000 because I said so, it's a PPAP, you got to do that. They're going to say, well, we've just done a PPAP over here, and the buyer may not even know what all the requirements are. So you've got to inform the buyer to say, hey, look, your engineering department's asking for this. Typically when we submit this, we do not have to pay for that. So it's just kind of making sure that they're aware, because you're not your buyer is ultimately not the engineering contact at your customer. So just kind of making sure they understand the story, right?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense. And I want to touch on one more point related to this, since so far the steps that we mentioned are primarily related to testing, and that is going to be related to material. But initially, when we started talking about this, and that you mentioned that it is really the supplier quality, right? So in this particular case, we are really testing the material. It could be related to supplier, but I mean, at the end of the day, we are really touching the material. So do we have any specific metrics that we need to test from the supplier perspective? For example, if the supplier is financially stable, where they are located, how they run their process, how they manufacture the material? Do we need to worry about all of this? Or if, let's say, the test passes for the product, are we going to be okay?
Yeah, so that is also is a very good point, and that's part of like your qualifying your suppliers, right? So
Yeah.
you're doing supplier quality audits. You're also looking to their, yes, I mean the financial end of it. You definitely want to make sure that they're not going to go out of business, right? Now,
Yeah.
a lot of customers and a lot of suppliers and whatnot sharing that type of information, especially on independent, suppliers where they're not owned by, a conglomerate of, where it's not like a publicly traded business.
Yeah.
They may be a little bit leery to share that with you, but getting references and getting things set up like that during your supplier audit is important. Making sure there's that relationship. I mean, it's like you want to do business with somebody that right? So getting to know your business that you're going to do business with, or your partners there. You want to understand that, hey, I trust this person, I trust this business. They've been what references, who have they been doing business with? Is it someone that you can reach out to and say, hey, how's your experience been with this customer or this supplier? I'm sorry. So,
yeah.
You really got to do a little due diligence there. I mean, it's just no different than if you have someone coming up to you and you're going to start doing a small business with them. You really want to know that the values line up, right? You've got the same values, the same core beliefs that this person or this business has. You really want to make sure that moving forward that you can work together. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. In fact, I am going to ask some more clarifying questions there so that our listeners are able to understand, if they are going through this PPAP journey. So obviously, let's say if I'm the owner, I am going to do my due diligence the way I have been doing. I am going to I'm going to check the supplier, and I am in the business because I have been doing that. But now when I am working with my automotive customer, they have their own way of checking things. They have their own way of vetting the suppliers. And in my experience, I think that's where the PPAP comes in, right? So they are going to have some sort of compliance that, okay, I want you to check these things. Point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, point number 4. And if you are not doing that, maybe I should not be doing business with you, right? So as part of the PPAP process, when you talk about at the sales order level, obviously they are going to ask, okay, since this product is very unique, I am going to ask you, okay, include this testing along with whatever else you do as part of your regular quality procedures. So can you have the supplier quality audit triggered as part of the additional mandate that you are getting on that specific transaction, on that specific product? Or do you have sort of the annual audit as part of the PPAP that you have to do to make sure that you are auditing your suppliers, you are auditing your processes? But if there are going to be any product related issues, that's when you need to negotiate at the time of the transaction.
So yeah, it's interesting because there are multiple ways of looking at it, and with the automotive, there are specific standards that they do want you to at least revisit your PPAP annually, to ensure that you are still meeting your requirements. Okay. Through time, through processes, there may be process improvements, process changes. There may be things like that you maybe even if they're a little slight that need to be taken into account, or those are the times to actually bring them up and submit those through to your customer, because there a lot of times the automotive industry does require annual PPAP. And depending what tier level you are, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, whatever it may be, you may or may not be required to do that. It may be on your customer's plate to do that on your behalf, or so that's one part of this. And then you mentioned something about certain criteria that may be required. It may be something that is too important to say we're doing this once a year. It may be saying, hey, I need this testing done once a quarter, whatever it may be, but that would be spelled out as well with in your initial thing. And if it's not spelled out, it doesn't mean that you may not do it, because you may find that there's value you got peace of mind, right? You're going to do something and you say, well, I think everything's good. They're not requiring us to do this testing, every time we get in a lot. We're not going to test this lot of material and say every time it comes in, we want to make sure it meets it. But they don't require that. But you may have, if you've ever been through something and you understand that the things don't always go as planned.
Yeah.
So you may want to do extra testing if it's a super critical or super high profile type of a product. That would be kind of determined on, job basis there, right?
Yeah. So interesting. So let's talk about the overall journey of PPAP, and obviously you have been in this space for some time, right? So when we look at any of these standards, they are typically trying to evolve. For example, the reason why Automotive is trying to do this is because they want to make sure that the parts that are going in the car, they are safe. So we are safe as human beings, right? That's why we have these documented process that they want everybody to follow so that we don't run into issues. But then, as you mentioned, that when you plan something, it does not go as planned. So there are going to be changes in these standards as well. So over the period of time, I'm pretty sure you have seen a lot of changes in the PPAP process as well. So let's say if you were to dig into some of the changes that you have seen from 10 years back to 5 years to right now, what are those changes? Do you have any insight there by any chance?
Yeah, there's several examples there that we could talk about. One of them being on the process end of it. When we were setting up for a job one time, and we thought everything seemed to check out. You do your first samples. You do a reset. You sample it again. You get going, and you're doing multiple samples just to prove out, hey, the repeatability of this process. And
yeah,
we on a day that we were having, one of our customers come in, and they're bringing in their customer as well. We were setting the job up, and I'm getting called to the floor saying, hey, this is not working. Our stuff's not working right. And you start going through every part of that process and try understanding, hey, what did we miss and what's going on. And in that instance, it was something simple. They put the wrong nozzle on the machine, but
yeah.
It was spelled out, but yet it wasn't followed. So there's things like that you've got to almost put checks in place to make sure that does happen. So there's, even though you have a process in place, and if you follow that process, everything works well. There may be something that's not communicated well to the floor where they followed the exact process, and you've got to reevaluate and recommunicate that.
Yeah, and in your experience, when you are working through these things where, let's say, you have documented everything and you thought that you communicated with your people, but things are still not being followed. So what can, let's say, owners do if they are going through the similar experience that, what, I have tried to document this, nobody really looks at it, nobody cares for it, they are not following. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to stop documenting. So in your experience, what have you seen as the practical strategies that really work on the shop floor when it comes to complying with some of these standards?
So yes, your processes are important, but your training for your people is very important.
Yeah.
Right now, I think everyone is struggling with the same thing that we see across our industry and other industries is labor shortages, and then having, the properly trained people there to do it. So, we started talking, I brought on a few people here this year, and as I start to do the training, the guys will look at you and say, well, what did you just do? And you start stepping through the process. And in my mind, the process is maybe I can go through my head and I can step through this process. But then when you're trying to teach somebody something, you start realizing that, hey, if you don't have an understanding of what this is about, you've got to break it down to another level into either some sort of a actual manual, something that anyone can follow. And what we look at is we say, okay, and we probably put it into terms that may or may not be, I guess, when you look at it, we say we want to find someone that has no experience with it. And just have them walk through it. So, we may say you look for the dumbest person in the room, but that's not really what you're doing. You're looking for someone with no experience. So we maybe say something we shouldn't say, but ultimately our goal is to find somebody that doesn't have experience and can read through your process and make sure they understand it, because ultimately people don't want to do something wrong. They want to do it right. But if it's so complex that you've got to stand on one leg, hold your arm up in the air, and close one eye in order to make this work, nobody's going to follow that. So you got to make it easy.
Exactly. So insightful, to be honest. I mean, that's a real thing right there. A lot of people, they just feel that, it's not really the communication, but every time when you look at the processes, when you look at any of the compliance, it's all about how you are communicating things. It's not how creative your processes are. If they are not adopted, if they are not followed, then they don't add any value to the business, and you are probably not going to get the results. So I know that you wanted to cover the SUV story that you had that we were discussing in the pre-show related to the failures of PPAP. Do you want to briefly touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, and that one there, I mean, we were, that part is to say that was one of our kind of entry into the PPAP field or market, where we were actually, hey, we're just getting comfortable. It was maybe our third or fourth PPAP that we had found. It was a little higher profiled one at the time. It was an SUV that was coming out for a specific market, and they were kind of bridging the gap into this market. And when the customer it was coming in, and our parts weren't meeting the spec because of something that one of our processing guys did, it was very frustrating at that part, because we, at that point, we don't even know what's wrong, right? We just know that the process that we put in place, they're not meeting what we said we were meeting, we're not doing. And so you start looking at it and you start digging in, and you have to go through every little line item in order to figure out what we've missed and then why it's not working. From even, you look even at the machine to make sure the machine's not malfunctioning. And setting our process and having a tight process, we felt really confident at that point that we had a great process. And turns out, like I said, that job only had, someone put the wrong nozzle on it, and that was enough of a change that our parts were not good. So when you start looking at your potential failure modes, that was one that we maybe didn't put enough emphasis on. So once we got that fixed, that product ran through the life of that really well. I mean, it was a very good success story after a struggle. Just something that we're probably, it was unfortunate the timing that the customer's on their way and they're en route, and you're not making what, and we had it fixed prior to them coming in, so really they didn't know, but we were able to put other things in place to make sure that, hey, we're not going to have that problem again. That's really, in a nutshell, it's just, it was just kind of a great learning experience for us going through that whole thing. We had great customers at the time to really deal with it. They really worked with us to make sure that we understood what their expectations were, because we were in that first stages of actually stepping into that market.
Okay, amazing. So that's it for today, Ken. Do you have any last-minute closing thoughts for our audience or advice?
No, I guess just looking at it, I'd say, keep it simple. Work with your customers. Make sure that you understand their requirements, because that's really when a lot of what I've seen it comes down to is kind of miscommunication between people, why things don't work. If you misunderstand what the requirements are, it can really put a lot of delays in it. So putting that extra effort into the communication and building that relationship with your customer, because really ultimately customers can come and go pretty quickly, and you really want to deal with the customers that are going to stick with you for a while and build that relationship.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from the conversation is going to be, even though you might not appreciate some of those things that are being mandated by PPAP, they might not make sense to you, but they are there for a reason. They are there to improve your relationship with the customer. The more upfront you are, the more you are communicating with your customer, and the more upfront you are in setting the expectations for your PPAP needs that you might encounter as part of your product, the more easier it is going to be maintain those relationships, and the more business you can win from your existing customers as well as new customers. On that note, Ken, I really want to thank you for your time. this has been a powerful episode.
All right. Thank you, Sam. I enjoyed it myself.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about CAN, head over to falconplastics.com. It's falconplastics.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Melissa Drew, who discusses the product life cycle of automotive products and how it is different from other industries. Also, the interview with Paul Critchley from New England Lean Consulting, who discusses practical examples of how to apply 5 S's of Lean to your organization. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.